Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final lecture in our Lenten series, The Spirit of Music in Community, here at St. Thomas's Anglican Church. My name is Larry Beckwith, and I welcome you on behalf of Father Nathan Humphrey, who is rector here, and the Friends of Music at St. Thomas's, which is a relatively new group of supporters of an expanded St. Thomas's music program. We are delighted that Elizabeth Anderson has recently been confirmed as our Director of Music, and that on July 1st we will be welcoming Manuel Piazza as our assistant organist. So for the first time in a long while, we will have two full-time musicians in the building to set about to continue the wonderful tradition of music making that already exists, and to build upon that tradition with a new program for young people, an outreach program in the neighborhood, renewed relationships with a wide variety of the city's musical organizations, and the presentation of series like this one. In the coming weeks and months, you will be hearing more about the Friends of Music at St. Thomas's, and we hope you will give it your support. This series has been a wonderful experience, and we've been grateful to those who have attended both in person and online over the past few weeks. We've heard an examination of the Christian message in the songs of Bruce Cockburn. We've heard about the background and compositional process of the French-Canadian Métis composer Ian Cusson. And by the way, Ian's new opera Of the Sea is on now at the Bluma Appel Theatre. We've heard about the background and approaches of Canadian composer with Mennonite roots, Stephanie Martin. And last week we heard from the Sudanese-Canadian multi-instrumentalist, singer, and composer Walid Abdulhamid. I'm very proud that we have presented some of the leading figures in the vast and varied musical community of Toronto, and we continue in that same spirit with tonight's guest. I'm not going to read John's full bio, which is available quite easily online, but I will say that John Abberger is one of the world's leading performers on historical oboes. He is the principal oboist with the Tafelmusik Orchestra and the artistic director of the Toronto Bach Festival, which is an annual weekend of events dedicated to the music of J.S. Bach. This year's festival takes place May 26th to 28th, and I believe the tickets are on sale now. It doesn't say so explicitly in any of his bios, but John is a very beautiful player, and I would argue as an oboist, he has a special connection to the music of Bach. If you look at the catalog of Bach's music, you would initially say, oh, he didn't write much music for solo oboe. But all you have to do is listen to or look at the score of most of the cantatas of Bach and the Passions, and you might surmise, as I have, that Bach used the voice of the oboe almost as the wordless soul of man, or the Holy Spirit. It turns up again and again at just the right time to express the inexpressible. And it's been such a privilege for us here in Toronto to hear John's playing in that role and others through the over 30 years that he has been on the scene here. Please welcome John Abberger.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that glowing introduction. And my thanks to Father Humphrey and to the Friends of Music for inviting me to speak to you tonight. It's a real privilege. And I'm looking forward to sharing a few thoughts with you about this man, this person, this composer that's obsessed me for most of my professional life, Johann Sebastian Bach. Now, for most of us, Bach doesn't really require a lot of introduction, but I want to take you through his life, particularly looking at it through his composition of these cantatas that Larry has just referred to. This year at the Toronto Bach Festival, we are giving a special focus to the year 1723, 300 years ago, because this is the year in which Bach left a post at the princely court of Cöthen and took up his position in Leipzig as cantor and director of music for the city of Leipzig, a post which, as I'm sure many of you know, he held until the end of his life. And so this is a really important, pivotal moment in Bach's life. And I want to give you a little background and build up to this moment and explain how we can view that through his compositions, particularly through his cantata compositions. Now, I'm going to take a little side step to build on something Larry just said. Well, actually, I can easily work it into what I was already going to say. So Bach was lionized, canonized in the 19th century as one of the great composers. And the model for that in the 19th century was Beethoven, of course. Beethoven, the composer that broke a lot of the molds of music as it was understood at that time. And so they wanted to see everyone through those eyes. And finally, in 1873, this great biography of Bach by an amazing scholar, Philip Spieda, appeared and gave the world this picture of Bach in a completeness that had never been seen before. But at that time, there was very little known about the dating of Bach's compositions. And we still have a lot of unknowns in that respect, but there's been some very interesting work that has occurred, well, now over 50 years ago, but still in the 20th century, about the dating of Bach's works, and it gives us a different picture of Bach's compositional process, not process of composing, but his compositions through the course of his career as a composer in the Germany of his time, and particularly, well, in all the places where he worked. So the old concept of Bach's composing of sacred music presupposed that he composed sacred music throughout his career because he was a profoundly religious man, and that was the only thing that mattered to him. Now, I believe that Bach was a profoundly devout Lutheran. I believe he was a profoundly religious man. But the portrait that emerges when we are able to reevaluate the dating of his compositions sheds a little bit of a different light on that. So walk with me through Bach's life, getting up to the year 1723. I think we will be able to discover some interesting things. Now, as I said, in the past, Bach's life has been conceived of by the posts that he held throughout his career, and that's still a valid way of organizing our view of Bach. So the sort of, other than his birth, the first thing we know is that he was a choir boy at the St. Michael's School in Lüneburg in the year 1700, and he was there for 2 years. And we know he was exposed to a lot of great organ music in nearby Hamburg. And also, it is believed, although much of what we know about Bach's life is conjecture, and so I want to say that at the outset, and I'll try to identify where it's conjecture and where it's the few places where it's not. But it is believed that what we know that the court at Celle, which was near Lüneburg, had an orchestra. And this orchestra was likely composed of musicians from France that had been expelled only 15 years earlier in 1685, which happens to also be the date of Bach's birth, but that was the year that Louis XIV issued the Edict of Nantes, which expelled the Protestants from France. And the oboe was more or less developed in France at Versailles for Louis's court. And so it's believed that some of these Protestant musicians had to leave, well, they had to leave France, and they went to Berlin, they went to other places in Germany, they went to Amsterdam, quite most assuredly, they went to London. There was this diaspora of Protestants, and many of them were musicians. So it's believed that there must have been a fine oboist at the court at Celle that Bach heard as a very young man, and we believe that may have inspired him to write so many wonderful parts for the oboe, as Larry said, in his cantatas. Throughout his life, we find extraordinary compositions for the oboe. He truly did seem to understand the instrument very, very well and wrote very idiomatically for it. So Bach's first exposure, if you will, to music outside of his own family, which was very, very musical, of course, was at the choir school of Lüneburg. In 1703, he was his first real professional job, he was called a lackey at the Weimar court, and he was there only for a short time, January through July of 1703. He almost surely played the violin and the organ at the Weimar court. We don't really know any other details about precisely what he did at that time. In August of 1703, he took up a position in the city of Arnstadt as organist, and he was there from 1703 through the year 1707. And it's during that time that he made his famous trip to Lübeck, where he encountered the music of Buxtehude. He walked there and back, and he was this extended absence for which he was reprimanded, and so forth. In 1707, he took up a post as an organist in the city of Mühlhausen, which was a promotion for him, and he worked there only for about a year. He moved back to Weimar, where he was the Kapellmeister, and he was required at that point to write cantatas at about one a month, it's believed, during his time in Weimar. And he was there until he moved to Köthen, which was a princely court, and he was in charge of chamber music there primarily. And we don't have any evidence of a lot of sacred cantatas that were written at that time. And then, of course, it was in 1723 that he left Köthen and took up his post in Leipzig. Now, as I said, for such a composer of such stature, we know a certain amount about his professional life, which we can glean from records of his appointments, which is what I just detailed for you, and his music, of course, music written for different occasions. But we actually know almost nothing about Bach's personal life. Now, that we have one very, very interesting bit of evidence I'm going to share with you in a few minutes that directly explains this shift that I'm talking about in 1723. But I want to just share you in case for a bit of amusement. So Bach scholars have scoured the world for every possible shred of evidence about him, any document that is written to him, and there's so little to draw on that there is a book called Bach Documents, and it's fascinating to know that document number 299 is an excerpt from the Leipzig Municipal Account Book, and it records that on the 17th of November 1731, in conjunction with the renovation of the St. Thomas Choir School building, the town executioner, whose name was Hartmann Hieronymus Heinze, was tasked with cleaning out the privy belonging to the cantor's living quarters, a task for which he received 6 pfennigs. So we're so desperate for evidence of anything about Bach's personal life, no matter how personal it might be, that even that has made its way into the documented records of Bach's life. I share that because it's amusing, but because I want you to understand how little we really know about his personal life. So I want to talk for a minute now about this subject of dating Bach's works, which really did revolutionize our understanding of his career as a composer. Now, many works cannot be dated accurately. Much of the instrumental music cannot be dated. He did not customarily put dates on his music. Occasionally he did. But in the 1970s, 2 very, very pioneering German musicologists, one named Alfred Dürr and another named Georg von Dadelsen, came up with a system of evaluating the paper that the works are written on and correlating this with where that paper would have been sourced and where Bach was in his life. And they then correlated that with the sacred cantatas and the occasions for which they were written, the points in the church year when these works would have been performed. And they were able to come up with a construction of Bach's life in a dating of his sacred cantatas. So I did have a couple of pages of handout, and if you'll refer to the one that says the cantatas of Johann Sebastian Bach. So before 713, which is before his appointment as Kapellmeister in Weimar, in fact, he was a bit of an assistant. The actual Kapellmeister was very old and very elderly and very ill, and so he was unable to fulfill his duties, so Bach was basically required to take his job. But before that time, we only know of 6 cantatas, and we can't really date them very accurately, but they are obviously of an older type of cantata that Bach wrote these early examples, very, very powerful works, all of them, bearing his stamp of his compositional genius quite unmistakably. But there is an issue throughout Bach's life of a text to be set, and this is something he struggled with throughout his career. And so in many cases, we don't know who wrote the libretto, so to speak. We don't know who wrote the poem that Bach set. But a lot of these early cantatas directly set verses from the Bible. Of course, he did that later in with other cantata settings as well. So I want to play you just a little bit of an excerpt from his cantata, which, and you need to know that the numbering system has nothing to do with the chronology. So this is one of Bach's early cantatas. So we have a beautiful introduction with an oboe solo, and we get instantly this extraordinary sense of setting the text. Aus der Tiefe ruf ich zu dir, out of the depths I cry to thee, Lord. And we get first auf der Tiefe, he goes down out of the depths, and then ruf ich zu dir. So just extraordinary sense of the text and sense of setting the text. Again, 6 works from this early period, all of them showing this kind of extraordinary sense of setting text. We don't seem to possess any formative works. Like the first works we have in this genre of cantata music just seem instantly masterpieces. It's quite extraordinary. There must have been some works that are lost that might have been shown a little bit less of a sure hand, but we're very fortunate to have these extraordinary works. So with some of the keyboard music, we can see some experimentation and formative compositional experiments, but with these cantatas, even these earliest ones, the quality is just extraordinarily high. So before 1713, 6 cantatas. We do know of one secular cantata that we know was written at this time for the Duke of Saxe-Weissenfeld's the so-called Hunt cantata. So already, which is something I'm going to touch on in a minute. Excuse me. There were non-sacred cantatas that Bach wrote throughout his career, and he applied the same sense of text setting and the sense of high musical standards to those as well as his sacred works. So in 1713, he goes to Weimar, and he's, as we said, required to compose cantatas generally once a month. We have a total of 19 cantatas that come from this period. It's quite a long period, so we don't know if there are cantatas that were lost. There almost surely are cantatas that were lost. There are cantatas, particularly from Leipzig. Printed books of the texts of the cantatas were disseminated months in advance, and we have texts for cantatas that we no longer possess the music for. So we know that there are compositions that we've lost, and there may well have been others that we don't know, the cantatas that we don't have. Well, I want to just play you an example of a cantata from Weimar. This one, Himmelskönig sei willkommen, King of Heaven be welcomed. Fantastic music. A great example of a cantata from the Weimar period. Plenty of oboe music also from the Weimar period, as well as you just heard in this one, recorder. So, cantata production picks up in Weimar. Again, he struggles with librettos, with poems, with text to set poetry. At this time, various poets would produce poetry for an entire annual cycle of cantatas. And so Bach set some of those. Erdmann Neumeister was a well-known poet who published these libretti, so to speak, and Bach set a number of those cantatas, but to music, made cantatas from those texts. And but he didn't consistently do that, and he chose poets from different times. As we can see later in Leipzig, he tries out other authors. I'll talk in a minute about a very fruitful collaboration he had with a poet in Leipzig, but this is something he struggled with continuously throughout his career, of finding a text that he felt that was suitable for setting to music. We have these 19 cantatas from this period. Now, Bach then left Weimar and went to the princely court of Anhalt-Köthen, where he was Kapellmeister there for a period of 6 years, but he wasn't required to write cantatas at that court. Now, we have this one really interesting, illuminating letter that Bach wrote to basically a school friend of his from his Lüneburg days, a guy named Georg Erdemann. And he's writing to Erdemann because this is now in 1730. So this is already well after he's established himself in Leipzig, but he's unhappy there at this point in his life, and he's looking for another post. But he gives us this incredible insight into some of the events of his life. So he writes to Erdemann, and he says, "Most honored sir, your honor will have the goodness to excuse an old friend and faithful servant for taking the liberty of disturbing you with the present letter. It must be nearly 4 years since your honor favored me with a kind answer to the letter I sent you. I remember at that time you graciously asked me to give you some news of what had happened to me, and I humbly take this opportunity of providing you with the same. You know the course of my life from my youth up until the change in my fortunes that took me to Köthen as Kapellmeister. There I had a gracious prince who both loved and knew music, and in his service I intended to spend the rest of my life. It must happen, however, that the said Serenissimus should marry a princess of Barenberg, and that then the impression should arise that the musical interest of the said prince had become somewhat lukewarm, especially as the new princess seemed to be unmusical. And it pleased God that I should be called hither to be director musicis and cantor at the St. Thomas School. Though at first, indeed, it did not seem at all proper to me to change my position of Kapellmeister for that of cantor, wherefore then I postponed my decision for a quarter of a year. But this post was described to me in such favorable terms that finally, particularly since my son seemed inclined toward university, I cast my lot in the name of the Lord and made the journey to Leipzig, took my examination, and then made the change in position. And he goes on to complain about what's going on in Leipzig, which is not really the point of my talk tonight. But this is an incredible, this is the most personal knowledge we have of Bach's life. And he explains that he took this post in Köthen and he was initially very happy, and the prince loved music, and we believe this to be true based on, again, our guesses that this court, there was lots of chamber music. There were church cantatas. We just don't have any evidence of cantatas that he wrote. We actually have a few texts that we know were performed in Köthen. We don't have the music for those cantatas. So we know he probably wrote cantatas then, but in terms of what we have surviving, we don't have any sacred cantatas from Köthen. And of course, what he did write is unbelievable instrumental music. Now, most Bach scholars nowadays, particularly recently, like to argue, oh, you can't prove that that's when he wrote these pieces, but it's such an easy thing to know that he was performing instrumental music, chamber music, at the court in Köthen. And we do know that in 1721, he copied out a set of concertos that you might have heard of called the Brandenburg Concertos. He copied out a set of 6 concertos for various instruments, and he made a very beautiful copy, and he dedicated it to the Margrave of Brandenburg and sent it off. And of course, you probably all know that we don't have any evidence that he was ever even paid for this or that the Margrave ever even performed them. In fact, many people think it's quite unlikely that the Margrave performed them because he didn't have an orchestra that had all those instruments. Of course, he could have put one together for some kind of special occasion. But, you know, some of Bach's greatest music, I'm going to play you what I think might be, but it depends on the day, my favorite Brandenburg movement. Unbelievable music, right? Just, it doesn't get any better than that. The 4th Brandenburg Concerto. Another bit of evidence, you might say, certainly hard evidence. Again, so few pieces were dated, so the fact that the dedicatory score of the Brandenburg Concertos is dated 1721 is a huge idea. Almost surely these pieces were written in the preceding years. Some of them could have even been written in his days in Weimar, but certainly he assembled them, he refined them. We have early versions of a few of the concertos, a few of the movements, so we know that it's something he worked on, he polished, and again, he assembled them in this beautiful set and sent them off to the Margrave. Another work that we have a firm date for in Bach's hand on the title page, the first book of the Weltebrid Clavier, which came out in the year 1722. So think about that, just before the move to Leipzig, right? So probably that needs no introduction, but the most iconic of these works. I love that work because, to me, Bach is telling us at the very outset of this fairly substantial work, quite substantial work, that it's all about the harmony. There's no melody there at all, right? It's just a series of chords, and it's so beautiful. And perhaps as a side note, but the years that I've spent studying I realize that it is always for him about the harmony. He's not actually what I would call a great melodist, although there are certainly some very memorable moments, but it's always about expressing a text. That's really more what the melodic ideas do in Bach, and the underlying harmony is deeply expressive. So it's fascinating to me that that's how he started this work, with a piece that has basically no melody, in my opinion, but it's nonetheless a wonderful, wonderful piece. So this is what was occupying Bach prior to making this move to Leipzig. Now, as we just heard in the letter, he really did think that he was going to spend the rest of his life in Cöthen. He was going to be very happy, and as will happen, things changed in life, and he decided that it would be better for him to move to Leipzig. Now, if you look at your cantata list, so we've gone through early cantatas before 1713, 6 works, Weimar 19 works, Cöthen none that we know of, although secular works that we know were later recycled. Then Leipzig, take a look at this list now. So Bach gets to Leipzig in 1723, and his job is not just to write cantatas, but to become a preacher in music to the entire city, to be the director of music for the entire city, and to direct them in Christian principles as through his sacred works. So he sets out, I think I want to play another excerpt now. So we know that he wrote, there are two cantatas that we know he used as his audition pieces. So this would have been in February of 1723. So there's two cantatas that he wrote of. And so certainly those were written. Actually, one of them we know was written before he got to Leipzig for his trial, and one of them was written while he was doing his trial, when he could see what musicians he had to work with there. And in fact, the one that was written before, there's evidence that he revised it based on the musical forces that he found in Leipzig. But having written these earlier works that I've given you a sample of, I want to play you the first cantata that Bach performed in his new job as cantor, which was on the first Sunday after Trinity, and we'll talk about the church year in a moment, in 1723. This is what the congregation at the Thomaskirche heard. Rather dramatic stuff, I think. The text of this cantata is Die Elenden sollen essen. The wretched shall eat. And he does just a remarkable job to me of depicting this kind of wretchedness, this kind of hollowness, this hunger. I might play the very opening, beginning. He starts, the second chord is a very dissonant chord. It's just this stark, hollow sound and sparse texture, and then this oboe sort of crying up. It's quite extraordinary. Let's just listen to the very opening again. Powerful stuff. It appears that Bach embraced his new role with uncommon industry and application. So if you look at your list, you can see that in 1723, between 1723 and 1724. Now, let's take a look at your other handout, which tells you the ordering of the church year. Now, properly, the church year begins in Advent. Begins at Advent, I should say. And so that is 4 Sundays before Christmas. And in the Lutheran Church at that time, there was a celebration of Advent, the first Sunday in Advent, and then there was no music until Christmas Day. So Bach had a bit of a break then. But then you can take a look. Christmas Day, second day of Christmas, third day of Christmas, New Year's, Sunday after New Year's, Epiphany, Sunday after New Year's. It just keeps coming at him, right? Sunday after Sunday after Sunday that requires a cantata. Now, of course, he wasn't required to write a new cantata for every Sunday, but that's pretty much what he did for the first couple of years in Leipzig. It's just an extraordinary creative output of high quality music. So if you refer back to your other handout, in the first year, which the scholars call Jahrgang, which means annual cycle of cantatas, and so we, in terms of Bach's compositions, we start with the Sunday after Trinity because that's when he took up his post. So in that first year of 1723, between the first Sunday after Trinity and the last Sunday before Advent, 27 new works, 27 new pieces. And he recycled 19 older pieces. And in many cases, sometimes that meant just, he almost never just purely performed an old work. He usually added some instruments or rewrote this part or that part. So it's a lot of music that he was required to come up with. And he was very, very clever, you might say, although to me that kind of understates the case. He was very strategic, maybe is a better word, for deploying his resources with cantatas. And as I mentioned, and we'll see later, a little bit later, he often took works that were originally written in a secular context and refit them with words with sacred music, and did that very, very effectively. So that's not even a full year, 27 works. Then Advent to Trinity Sunday, so Advent 1723 to Trinity Sunday, 35 works, 17 of them new, a total of 36 new pieces, plus the first version of his setting of the Magnificat was performed on Christmas Day in 1723, and another small piece, the first setting of the St. John Passion, was performed on Good Friday in 1724. So we are looking at this extraordinary turning point in Bach's creative life in 1723. This keeps going. He continues in 17. Now, I want to say, before I go on, he not only established a new compositional standard for the composition of these sacred cantatas, which he regarded as sermons. So they often combined, they were certainly fitted to the readings of the day, whatever, of the Sunday, but commentary by the poet. There are cases where there are many cases where we don't know who the poet is, and we sometimes wonder if the poet was Bach himself. This is a question that will never be answered. So he not only set a very high standard, but he basically reinvented the cantata. Now, I don't want to go too far down this particular rabbit hole, but the earlier works that I referred to, there's a very important difference. I'm sure you have all heard Bach cantatas, and you probably mostly expect them to have these recitative movements, these movements that where it's much more declamatory, the text isn't repeated, it states the text in a much more declarative way, and it's often only with the basso continuo, just with an organ and maybe a cello or a harpsichord, and sometimes with strings, but strings basically providing the harmony against this declamation. But the earlier works do not have recitatives. So this was a change in the style of cantatas. It was actually the cantatas being fitted to the operatic style of the day. Now, of course, Bach never wrote operas, but his contemporary Handel obviously did, and oratorios as well. But Bach's cantatas are often mini dramas, mini operas, if you will, complete with recitatives and arias and choruses, right? So he kind of took this whole thing onto another level, and pretty much right away, with the piece that I just played for you is a perfect example of incredible mastery of text setting, incredible sense of what he wanted to communicate to the people of Leipzig. So he did this with great industry for the first year, and then in his second year, so beginning with the first Sunday after Trinity in 1724, he embarked upon a project. Again, the thinking is that he could not find librettos that he was happy with. So what he started doing is taking chorale texts. Now, at this time, again, many of you may know this, but a chorale, of course, is a melody, and it can have many different harmonizations, which is the chords underneath it, the harmony underneath the melody. But these chorales had 15, 20, 25 verses. So there's lots of poetry there to work with. So Bach came up with the idea of writing a cantata that was based both musically and textually on specific chorales. And he almost wrote an entire annual cycle of cantatas that are based on chorales. And so that's the Jahrgang 2 is often known as the choral cantata Jahrgang. The first Sunday after Trinity to the end of the ecclesiastical year, 25 new works. Advent to Trinity Sunday, 29 new works, 27 of them newly composed, plus a new version of the St. John Passion performed on Good Friday in 1725, in that year, the 30th of March. And later, in the course of his life, he wrote another, what's the number here? 13 choral cantatas that one could add to this Jahrgang. So clearly a genre that intrigued him. But the main thing I want to point out is this pivot from writing this amazing instrumental music in Kürten, taking up the post in Leipzig, and this unbelievable creative output of sacred cantatas. After 1725 into 1726, he still is writing a lot of cantatas, probably what for anyone else would be still a heavy compositional load, but for him, he'd slacked off a little bit. So the Jahrgang 3 is, in terms of an annual cycle, spans 2 years, and so, you know, not as many cantatas, but as you can see there, he did seem to find time to work on another small piece of music called the Matthew Passion, which saw its first performance on Good Friday in 1727. So again, incredible industry, incredible creative output. It's almost hard to imagine how one person could write this much music of this quality in such a short time. In terms of cantatas for the rest of his life, so in the years 1725 and 26, 15 newly composed works. Now we can document performances of cantatas by other composers in early 1726, cantatas by his cousin, Johann Ludwig Bach, and we also have documentation of a performance of a passion by another composer. It's believed that he did perform a passion every year on Good Friday, and we know that, of course, there were, in the end, by the end of his life, 4 versions of the St. John Passion. So it's fascinating that it's a work he grappled with. We don't know who wrote the libretto of the St. John Passion. There are bits of the poetry that are clearly owe something to a fascinating poem that was written, I actually don't know the exact date it was written. It was written I think it was written in about 1712 or 17, around there, by this guy, Brachus, wrote what is called a synoptic passion libretto. So it doesn't follow any single gospel. basically takes the best bits from all of them and assembles it into, it's quite a long poem, but a poem that seems to have really struck a chord with the Lutheran community in Europe at that time. So I should have these numbers in the top of my head, but I'm afraid to misstate them. But I'd say probably 12 to 15 settings of this poem by other composers, Mattheson, Fasch, Stolzel, it goes on and on and on. Handel set a reduced version of it. This is known as his Bacchus Passion. Telemann, a massive setting of it. An extraordinary work that's hardly ever performed. So this idea of performing passions was a big part of religious life at this time, and Bach participated in that heavily. So we think that there was a passion every Good Friday from the time he was in Leipzig. We don't actually know if he was involved in passion performances before then. There is some surmise that there was a passion setting by Reinhard Kaiser, and that Bach performed that in Weimar and added an aria or two to that. That's all a bit sketchy, but there are theories about that. But in any case, he grappled with the text of the St. John Passion. There are movements of the poetry that really, they clearly owe something to this poem by Bacchus, a handful of the arias. So he may have, someone else may have stolen those and written them into a poem, or maybe Bach did it himself. We don't really know. In any case, sometime around, need to just check my notes here, but sometime around, sorry, I've lost my place here, but 1726 or 7, he comes in contact with a poet whose pen name was Picander, but whose real name was Christian Friedrich Henrici, and he wrote the text of the Matthew Passion that Bach set. So there is a again, this is conjecture, but there's conjecture that I guess really primarily based on the greatness of that work of the Matthew Passion. As we all know, much more sprawling of work, a lot longer, many more arias commenting on the story of the Passion than the John Passion, which is kind of tighter dramatically, fewer interruptions of the dramatic flow. But clearly, Picander's poetry said something to Bach in that work. Picander in 1728, in the middle of 1728, issued his own collection of cantata texts. And Bach set 10 of these texts in 1728 and 1729. And after 1729, which of course was the year that we know of the second performance of the Matthew Passion, which was a slightly different version from the version that was first performed in 1727, but only really, compared to the St. John Passion, very, very minor changes to that work. But after that, insofar as we're able to document with this method of dating, Bach's cantata production really was greatly reduced. And there are sporadic cantatas that were written later in his life, but not nearly the furious activity that we saw in the years 1723, 24, 25, 26. But I will add to that in 1734, Christmas 1734 on into Epiphany 1735 saw the first performance of the work that we now know as the Christmas Oratorio, which is a collection of 6 cantatas. And these were almost exclusively recycled from the secular cantatas. Now, I haven't talked much about those, and I don't want to distract from my main point about his compositional activity of sacred cantatas in the year 1723 and 24 and 25, but and sacred music in general. But Bach did write cantatas that were for the birthday of someone, or the election of someone to the town council, or the election of someone to the university as the rector of the university, or to praise the king. I mean, the secular cantata I referred to earlier that was written in 1713, or has to have been written before 1713, as I said, was written for Duke Johann Christian of Saxe-Weissenfels, and that work basically talks about how wonderful the hunt is and what a great thing it is and how everyone should love it. But it mostly, it's sort of what's called a congratulatory cantata, because it talks about how great Duke Johann Christian was. And of course, there is a very famous movement from that cantata, which we now know as the piece Sheep May Safely Graze, which was written as an aria for soprano in that cantata. And that particular movement expresses the sentiment that sheep can be safe where a good shepherd watches, and where rulers govern well, people can feel safe and secure and happy. And that's basically the import of the text of that book. So again, great text setting. He would take these pieces and repurpose them into sacred works. We don't know that he ever did that with Sheep May Safely Graze, but we can see this happening with many, many works, and most famously in the Christmas Oratorio, where he repurposed some secular works and to great effect. So one could think of it that Bach, he seems to have known that he wrote music of high quality, and he didn't want to throw it away on a one-off occasion. So he would put it, if you can put it into a sacred cantata, even one for, or maybe especially one for a Christmas fest celebration, is something that gives it a much longer life. So the surmise is that once he had established these annual sets, that he could then just re-perform them or choose from them for the rest of his career. He basically amassed this repertory that he had performed. But I find it just so fascinating, this amping up of the compositional activity when he took up his post in Leipzig. So at this year's Toronto Bach Festival, we will have an opening concert of great concertos. Not a Brandenburg, sadly, but not sadly, because we've got other great concertos, but we'll have the wonderful E major violin concerto, one of his greatest concertos. We'll have the D minor concerto for harpsichord, C major concerto for 2 harpsichords, and then we'll have a performance of the complete Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier by our guest artist, Stephen Devine. And that will take us into our final concert on Sunday, when we will perform the cantata you just heard the opening of, which is number 75, Die Elenden sollen essen, and on the following, we will also perform the cantata that he performed on the following Sunday. So we'll hear the first 2 cantatas that the congregation heard in Leipzig. So our festival this year will be a bit of a microcosm of this fascinating moment in Bach's life. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and I'm sure John will stay around for a few minutes if you have some,
Absolutely.
Questions or want to chat with him. But have a wonderful evening, and thank you again for coming. Yes, you.
Well, Betty Angs just pointed out March 31st is his 438th birthday.
21st, yeah. March 21st, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, so we just celebrated his birthday last week. Yeah. Thanks, everyone.